Good afternoon, everybody. We are going to go ahead and get started. We have some people that join us throughout, but we'll go ahead and get started. That way we can make sure we have time for questions at the end. Again, a copy of the slides and a copy of the recording will be available once this training is completed. If you have any questions during the training, please feel free to raise your hand or put a question in the chat window, and I will respond to it either during, especially if it pertains to the slides of what we're talking about, or at the end when we have time for questions. If we don't have a chance to get to your question, we will definitely still get a response out to you. And in the slides, any questions that we have that come up, I will include like a frequently asked questions section that has that information also. So that way you don't necessarily have to watch the recording again if you're looking for a specific answer. So we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Brian Leapley. For those of you that do not know me, I am the Pinellas HMIS System Administrator, and we're going to be covering the Completeness and Timeliness reports specifically. So if we're looking at some of the other reports, there are a lot of reports in HMIS. We're not going to get into those today. I am hoping to really start providing additional training on some of the existing reports throughout the year in a format similar to this. So definitely after the turn of the year, when we start 2022, I can't believe it's almost December already, we will be doing some more trainings for reporting. So for this training, we're going to cover a number of different topics, again, focusing on completeness and timeliness, but we're going to look at what completeness and timeliness are. We're going to look at the overview of the reports, what they look like, the information they contain, how you can use them. We're going to talk about how you run the reports, and then also how you actually go about correcting the reports as well. This is not connected to like the 640 report. It's specifically around completeness and timeliness, but a lot of the basic ideas here can also be taken to some of the other reports. So any corrections that you look at in this may apply to a different report as well. So the first thing is completeness and timeliness. What are they? It's a very simple question, but some people do get confused about what it means. And I think with completeness, it's really about, are you asking all of the questions and are you recording those responses? That's really it for completeness. This isn't about necessarily the quality of those responses or anything else. It's just, are you making sure that staff are asking, how does the client identify their race, their gender, what was their prior living situation? It's just actually going through and asking that information. And most importantly, if you ask it, making sure that information is entered into HMIS. It's really a basic principle, but it is the foundation of pretty much everything else that we do with HMIS. If we don't have the information in the system, we can't do anything with it. So asking those questions and collecting that information is the foundation for all of the other work that's done from the database. And then timeliness is one that I think most people have a pretty good understanding of, but there's one part that does tend to confuse people. And that is, timeliness is looking at how quickly you're getting the data into HMIS based on when the service was offered and then when the information was added. And really this comes down to, can another provider see that enrollment or see that service very shortly after it's actually offered? So if you check someone into your shelter today, and then another provider looks at that client record, like let's say they go for just a drop-in basic service, can they see that they're connected with your shelter, or is there a lag between when they actually entered and when that data was put in? And that really is why completeness is important. It's designed to be kind of this collaborative method of knowing where someone is at any given time. And so the closer to real-time data we get, the better decisions we can make, the better we understand the client situation, because we're seeing that information as close to real time as possible. There's not a 1-2 day lag, a 7-day lag, even longer. So it's really about just getting that information in so other people can see it. And then you also know who is in your program at any given point. These two things, completeness and timeliness, are not the only parts of data quality. There's accuracy, there's consistency, but they are important parts of the HMIS data, and they complement each other very well. We want to make sure that the data is in there in a timely fashion so we can report out on it. We can see where people are, and we want to make sure it's complete so we can see, that basic information, the income, the disabilities, their prior living situation, are they chronically homeless? We can see that essentially, in real time and as it's happening, and we're making sure that people are asking those questions of the people that they're serving. So now we're going to go into completeness. I just saw that Tony had a question about the slides being available after the course. Yes, they will be available after the course. We will most likely put them on the help desk once the recording finishes being processed by Zoom, and that will be available and then sent out in a link both to the attendees of the course and then also through the HMIS newsletter, which will be coming out sometime in December. So for completeness, the question really is, what is complete? And this is one that sometimes gets a little confusing because completeness is very different than something like data quality, because completeness is just, again, was the question asked and was the information put in? And really, we're looking for any response in HMIS as being marked as complete, as long as it's not marked as data not collected or it's not left blank. There are a few other cases where there might be very old responses back from TBIN, from the 2-on-1 days, where someone maybe put like a response that was written out as blank or multiracial or something like that, or an other category. That's not a HUD response for some of the questions. There are some of those historical responses that may come up as being incomplete. If you come across one, try to update it to the best, the best of your ability. If you're not sure, you can always send us a help desk ticket. But generally, we're looking at anything but data not collected and anything but leaving that response blank. If it's blank or data not collected, that means that the question either wasn't asked, or if it was asked, it wasn't added to HMIS. And so that's really what we're trying to get at. We need to get that information in there. The way that completeness differs from like the 640 data quality report is that in completeness, client doesn't know and client refused are acceptable responses. They're not usable data, but they do count as complete because a client does have the right, obviously, to refuse to respond to any question. They don't have to provide that information. It doesn't impact their ability to get services. And the other thing is they may not know the answer. You may have a situation where a client doesn't know how long they've been homeless this time, or how many total months, or how many times in the past 3 years. It impacts the usability of the data. It impacts our ability to, check some of that information and draw conclusions and plan based on the data in our system. But that's okay if a client doesn't know that information. We want to try and help them get to an actual response that we can use. But if they don't know it, there's nothing we can do about it. And if they refuse to share it again, that's within their right. So those are considered to be complete. They just aren't necessarily usable data points that we can use for other reports, or they'll show up as an error in the 640 data quality report, because that's really looking at the usability of the data. So again, client doesn't know, client refused are okay for completeness, but not necessarily in other reports. So again, just to sum that up, completeness is about if the information is in there, it's not about whether it's usable data or whether that data makes logical sense. Obviously, we want to get to usable data and we want to get to logical sense, but the first step really is just collecting that information and getting into the system so we can start drawing those conclusions and start reporting on that information. So there are 2 completeness reports, and they both basically work in the same fashion. It's just looking at, is there a valid response to the data element in question? That may be name, date of birth, social security, that homeless history. There are some slight differences in the data the 2 reports look at. The key difference, though, is where they measure that data from. So for entry exit, it's looking at data that's in that entry assessment specifically for that date of entry. So if you look at a client's record and you look at the entry assessment and there's a blank in there, that's going to be an incomplete response. It needs to be showing in the entry assessment, not just the profile or the summary. And that's the one part that does trip some people up, is that entry completeness is specifically looking at that enrollment. Services, on the other hand, is looking at what the client's data shows on the profile for the date that service was provided. So entries are kind of self-contained in that entry assessment. The service data is based on that client profile on the date the service was offered. So they're measuring the data at two different points. So what this looks like is this. So if we look at these blocks as the colored blocks, the yellow, the blue, and the dark blue are when the client is enrolled in the project. The green check is showing for that entry exit, these are the entry dates. So client A, week 1, day 1, was enrolled in a project. Week 1, day 1 data is what's being pulled for the entry exit completeness report. They're then enrolled in week 1 on day 7. Again, that entry data is going to pull. With these completeness reports, it will pull every enrollment and every service that overlaps that reporting date range that you pick. So if a client served multiple times, they'll show up in the report multiple times. So you can see it's not pulling any information after that. Any information that's in the client profile before that enrollment will pull into that entry assessment. If you've entered data, you'll see this when you add the record. Whatever's in the client profile on that day will show up. But anything added to the profile after that day doesn't show up in that entry assessment. That date is what matters. The data has to be in the system on that date or before. So any corrections that you make for entries need to go into that entry assessment to make sure that it shows up on that date. Services is the same basic principle, except it's based on that date of service. So in this case, you can see these clients are being served multiple times every single time that a service is provided. The completeness report is going to check to see, is that information complete? If you're serving a client for multiple days consecutively, they're not going to other providers, their situation may change, but generally if the information is in there from day 1, day 4, day 5, it's not going to be any different. Where this is important though, is if you look at like client A and client B overlap as far as like when they're getting services. So if you have a client like that, where these are multiple clients here, but if you looked at clients being served across multiple providers and they're going different places and they're getting different services from different people and they're updating that information, what you put in on day 1, on day 5 may have changed because a different provider put that information in. Hopefully they didn't change it to where something shows as incomplete, but it is something to be aware of. As you serve clients multiple times, that information does need to be rechecked. If there's an error that first time, that could count against you every single service. So if that's the case, going back to that first service and fixing it, should fix it for the rest of those services unless someone else came in and touched that record and changed the data as well. So entries pull from that entry date for every enrollment. Services pull from the date of service for every single service. And the other thing with the services too, so entries, again, fix that in the entry assessment. With services, you use backdate mode for the date of service. So my recommendation is to go back to the first service that person has, where there is that error, fix it there, and then check some of the others through backdate mode and see if that answer is still showing up. Otherwise, you may have to check it a couple times and fix it in a couple spots. But hopefully, it's just fixing it for that earliest service and it will fix it for all of the rest in succession. So the one major part I really wanted to address in this training, because this is also a point of confusion, is which report do you use? And the answer for that should be a single project should only use one of the reports. As an agency, if you have 10 projects for your agency, you may use one report for 5 projects, the other report for the other 5 projects. There really isn't a situation where I would ever recommend using both the entry exit and the service completeness report for the same project. The reason why I will talk about in a minute, we've already kind of covered it, but I'll make sure it's very clear so there's not confusion there. So this little flow chart kind of helps with that understanding. So if you use entry exit for your project, you'll track down onto the left side where if you answer yes, we use entry exits, whether or not you use services or not, you should be using the entry exit completeness report. So if you use services, entry exit completeness report. If you don't use services, entry exit completeness report. If you don't use the entry exit workflow and you use services, then you'd use the service completeness report. If you don't use the entry exit workflow and you don't use services, there's really probably not going to be data to pull for you. So I have question marks here, and really it comes down to what those services in the entry exit actually mean from a reporting perspective. And so if you use entry exits, even if you add services to those records from that same provider, that project should really only be checking itself with the entry exit completeness report. If you do both, it's not going to necessarily cause problems, but it's going to confuse staff a little bit because of how the reports work. So think of an entry date or a service date as basically a point in time that data is attached to. So if I enroll a client into my project, that entry becomes this point in time for that project that I can report on all of the data in that entry. With a service, every time they touch my project, that's another point in time where I can associate all of the client's responses to their assessment questions as of what's in their record on that date. So if you're using entries, most likely you're collecting the information at intake and you're putting it into the entry assessment. I don't think there are probably too many providers that are collecting information at intake and then verifying that information every time they offer a service. So what you're basically doing is saying, okay, we're collecting it at this point, but we want to check it every time they touch our project. And what that basically does is holds yourself accountable for data that's not being collected. So you pick the report based on at what point you are collecting and updating that client's information. If it's at entry, that's the report you use. If it's at every time you offer a service, you can use the service report, even if you use the entry report. But if you're not updating that information at services, all you're doing is creating more work for yourself. So again, I just want to stress, if you're using the entry exit workflow, and that's when you're collecting the client's information. If you are also running the service report, you are essentially holding yourself accountable for data that you're not putting in. And if someone is in your project and they go somewhere else for a dozen different services and that provider changes stuff up, but you're not checking it when they come back to get services from you because you're tracking it through that entry, by running the service report, again, you're holding yourself accountable for all of that other information. And so you're basically just adding to the amount of work that you have. So if you have any questions about your specific project and trying to figure out which assessment or which report you should use, I'll just sum it up by saying, if you're doing something like a housing provider, shelter, rapid rehousing, transitional housing, something like that, it's going to be the entry exit report. The only places that really are probably doing services only are like soup kitchens, some of the drop-in centers, places that don't do the enrollment process and the enrollment tracking. We probably have 95% of our programs that should be using entry exit, 5%, maybe a little higher, that are just using services. So if you have some specific questions, feel free to reach out to the help desk and we can help make sure that you're running the correct report. We basically just want to prevent you from creating more work for yourself to where you get frustrated because you're trying to figure out why the one says one thing, the other one says something else. But we want to make sure, if you are using completeness to report to funders, that you're reporting back things that are the best reflection of the work you're doing. So I'm going to cover running the reports kind of quickly. So The one downside to the reporting tool is that we do not have a test site for it. It only runs on our live site, so I don't want to focus on anyone's data or anything. So I'm going to walk through the steps on it. If you need help actually running the reports, you can feel free to reach out to us and we can set up some one-on-one time to cover your specific report or any issues that you're coming across. But we want to make sure that you do have access to this information. And again, this will be in the slides that are sent out to you. So for the reports, they are located in ART, which you can access from the top right corner. There's a button that says Connect to ART. That's the easiest way to get to it. In ART, you'll see this folder structure, and the reports for this are located in the public folder. There's a shared folder subfolder, and this is where you will find Completeness and Timeliness reports, as well as the 640, which is the other report used for certification. The reason this folder exists is if there's an issue that's discovered in the reports, these are WellSky published reports, then I can make changes locally here. They will be reflected in this. So I recommend using these because these include any local changes or modifications we have made that match with what our local requirements are. When you want to run one of the reports, you can click on the magnifying glass to the left of the name and you will get this pop-up window. The easiest way to do it is click View Report. Viewing report will let you run the report. Edit report lets you actually make changes to the programming language on the back end of the report. So if all you need to do is run it, just hit View Report. It runs a lot quicker actually, and is less likely to give you some of the errors that you get when you try to do custom reports right now. There's also the Schedule Report option. If you click on that, it will let you basically schedule the report to your inbox. You can schedule it for really any date you want. You can even schedule it for the same day and it'll just run in the background so you don't have to sit there and wait for it. And then it will put it in your inbox. Up here at the top of ART, there's a little inbox area. Once you click on View Report, it will give you the prompts for the report. Again, I'm not going to go through these in too much detail. I just want to point out a couple key things. Select providers. That's obviously where you pick the providers you want to include in the report. You can include 1, 2, 5, 10, 40, however many you want. Whenever you see EDA provider, the recommendation is just to leave that as default provider, unless there's a certain situation that arises where you need to change that for some reason. EDA provider is a kind of a visibility setting that impacts how the data shows up in the report. Generally for most projects, especially the older projects, there's no need to do it. In some instances with a newer project, especially if you're putting in data before that project existed, with the way visibility works in HMIS, it can cause some issues. You may want to use it then, but it's a case-by-case basis. The general recommendation is just to leave it as default provider. Start date, first date you want to include in the report, as simple as that. End date plus 1 day. Now, with most ART reports, you will always see the end date as plus 1 day, and that's because ART data is not live. It is a 24-hour delay, essentially an overnight delay for that data to show up. So if you make changes today, it's not going to show up until tomorrow. So the plus 1 day, whether it's a local report, a vendor published report, is basically to account for that. So just as a reminder that you're not going to be able to see data from today, so add a date to the last day you want to include in the report. And then for entry exit completeness, there is include services in the report card. I'll go into this in a little more detail in a little bit. This is basically saying I want to make sure that for all of our enrollments, we're adding at least one service to that record from that provider. If you are a shelter or housing provider that uses Shelter Point, when you check them in, that check-in is actually going to add that service automatically. So the great part about this is if you add that and you don't see that, it means someone wasn't checked into a bed or maybe something else happened that changed the data. Like I said, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's what that means. It includes just, is there a service provided for that enrollment? It could be one service, it could be 5, it could be 20. The reason this is optional is that you may have a situation where you enroll a client into a project that provides like financial assistance, but it's been a week, you're still processing their their documentation or whatever, you haven't actually offered that service yet. We generally train you to add just a case management service just to kind of show that you're working with the client. But if you don't do that as your workflow and you just add that financial assistance piece or some other service, it doesn't necessarily mean the data is missing. It just means you haven't done the service yet. So this is one that's not necessarily an error if there is a value missing on that one, if it shows up as null. It's a little more complicated than that based on your project and the workflow that you are using. For services, the prompts again are basically the same, so I won't really spend too much time on this. The key is that we do not have the include services in the report field because all we're pulling are services. Otherwise the same, select your providers, leave EDA provider as default, start date, end date plus 1 day. So now we're going to talk about what I really wanted to get to, which is correcting the completeness reports. This is what's probably going to take the longest time just because this is where the bulk of our information is coming from and what we need to do with these reports. So if you've seen the reports, this is your overall scorecard. There's one for the agency, which includes all the projects that you included in the report. And then there's a version of this that's broken out by each specific project. And so you can see all of the data elements that are required for this report, which covers the basic UDEs like demographics, the homeless history questions, head of household, their location. The additional data elements are basically that domestic violence victim survivor question, and then if they're receiving income, non-cash benefits, or health insurance, it's just the yes/no questions. And then the verifications, which are the list of the 15 income options, 10 health insurance, things like that, the little more detailed section. That's the one that we see a little more confusion on in this report because the way the report shows that information is a little more complex. The one thing I just want to point to on this page of the report is the required for section. This shows you who the information should be collected on in every situation. And so generally, if it says all, it means every single household member from the head of household to their partner to the children that they have associated with them, anyone that's in that household. If it says all, that information is expected to be completed for that intake or that service. If it says adults, that means anyone that's 18 and older, so things like veteran status, the homeless history questions, a lot of the things about income and non-cash benefits are looking at adults and head of household. HOH is head of household, so that would be whoever that primary client is that you're working with. And then there are a few other cases like you're only capturing destination when they exit the project. So it's adults and head of household at exit. With the entry exit, it's going to collect it for basically everybody by default. So when you complete that exit, select that destination, it will attach it to anyone that you select. So that will take care of it. So that may be a low number depending on how long people are enrolled in your project. And then we have for those adults and head of household that are receiving an income source, if they're marked as receiving an income source, we have income amount. It's looking for a dollar amount greater than 0. So if they're receiving employment income, the report is looking to make sure that a monthly amount is recorded. And I will go into those data elements in a little more detail again, partially also so you have access to these slides for staff. You can share this information freely. So what entries are included in the report is one thing to look at. So clients can be included more than once, and any entry exit that overlaps the reporting window is included. So in this case, if we have a reporting window from week 1, from day 2 to day 7, the only entry that is not included is client B's enrollment that starts on day 8. And that's because it falls outside of the 2 to 7 day window. Client A's first enrollment that started on the 1st is included because they exited on the 2nd, so it overlaps. Client B's first enrollment and client C's only enrollment are fully contained within the reporting window, and then client A starts the last day of the reporting window and carries over beyond that, all of those entries are included. So if you're seeing someone showing up more than once, this is why you may want to check and see, should they be in the project again? Is there an error there? There may be a case where you have two people or you have someone with the same enrollment date twice, some duplicate enrollments. So it's definitely something to check. If you also are seeing clients that are in the project for a long period of time, and they're still showing up in the report years later, we do see that from time to time. It just means, they probably need to be closed out unless you're still actually providing them services. So it doesn't matter if you checked someone in a day ago or, a decade ago. If they're still actively enrolled in that project, that's still going to pull into that report. So just keep that in mind with some of those really old records, especially for like PSH providers. That information will continue to pull in until that client is actually discharged. So this is what the client detail tab looks like. This is going to probably be difficult to read because it's quite large. I recommend saving the report as an Excel file because then you can easily sort this and look for the errors to fix. But this is basically going to give you the client number on the left, their entry and exit date, and then the OK or null values for all of those response questions from a couple slides ago. So you can see who is missing what data elements that need to be fixed. So anywhere you see a red value, whether it's a null or one of the numbers over here under the HUD verifications, that means there's an issue in completeness that should be addressed. Again, make sure you're also fixing errors in the entry assessment. I have seen people fix it in the profile, for several weeks later. Unfortunately, it will not pull in. And so if you do that, you're going to create a lot of extra work for yourself. So I can't stress that enough. Make sure any corrections for entry exit are made in the entry exit assessment itself. So again, just showing it a little closer, you can see the client ID, the entry date, and the exit date. From this, couple tips, I recommend looking for any old open entries. In this example, we have a client, the very first line that's been open since January 4th, 2010. It's been 11 years. If this is something like a shelter, it's probably not accurate. It's probably just a dangling entry that needs to be closed out. There are projects that could keep someone open that long, but just kind of keep an eye on that to see, is there someone who's showing up with a really old entry that doesn't seem to match your program? Might be worth looking into just to make sure when you report on clients served or your enrollments, you're able to report accurate numbers to your providers or to your funders. Also check for any duplicate entry exits. If you look and see that there's a client that has two entries on the same date, that's probably an error. So just kind of keep an eye out for some of that stuff and look for anything that stands out. This is the one section that people tend to skip over to go to those nulls and try to fix it. But there are some things that do show up in this that can provide some additional information and help with some of that overall data quality. So I definitely recommend just taking a look at this occasionally as you're running those reports and just you're looking for clients that are in there for way too long or people that you don't expect to see. Obviously, larger projects or larger agencies will have more difficulty with this, but this is a good spot, especially for some smaller ones, to try and look for a couple just extra pieces of information that can help. Now moving on to the data elements themselves. Most of these are going to follow the same basic principles what we talked about before, but there are a few nuances I want to make sure we point out. The best part is that once you go through the entry exit portion, the services completeness report is basically the same except far fewer data elements. So to start, for name, social, and date of birth, the biggest part we see missed on this is that these are looking at what responses are in those fields, making sure that a social is the full 9-digit number, that it doesn't fall into some of the kind of generic 8888, that's that style. But it also looks at the data quality field. And so I have the name and social one here as an example. And basically what we're looking for is some response here that does not match data not collected or that this is left blank. If this data quality field is left blank, but there is a name on the record, it's still going to come up as a null. The reason is because whenever this information is a client's data is submitted to HUD or one of the other federal partners, it's never submitted with identifying information. It's always submitted as basically kind of generic de-identified information that primarily pulls from those data quality fields. So it wants to make sure that that is filled out so that information shows up. And that is something we tend to see missed. So just make sure if you see a null for something like social security number, so this third line here, we do have this null value. Outside of checking to make sure the social is in there, make sure that the data quality field is also filled out as well. For race, again, it really is still looking for something that's not data not collected or left blank. But with race, it gets a little trickier because there is that primary, secondary race field. So if one of them is filled out, but the other is left blank or marked as data not collected, that will also show up as a null. With race, if they only identify as one race, secondary race should be marked the same. That's something that we do see skipped or forgotten by some end users. Just remember, if someone identifies as Asian as their primary race, doesn't identify as something else, it should be marked as Asian. There are some changes coming to HMIS that should make that data collection a little simpler, but there's a lot of stuff coming from HUD, so some of those changes have been delayed a little bit, but just keep an eye out for that. And race is also one where we see some of those old fields, like multiracial as an option, that usually comes from old point in time counts. Some of those old responses that aren't valid responses that are still in there. So if you see something, it may just be that it's an old response that needs updated. It may be that primary is filled out, secondary is left blank. So just keep an eye on both of those questions. Ethnicity and gender, again, looking for anything but data not collected or left blank. That one's pretty straightforward. Veteran status is the same thing. The one caution I will say with veteran status is that anyone who turns 18 needs to have that collected. And we do have cases where someone is under 18, when the information is filled out, it's maybe marked as not applicable or even left blank because it's a minor. When they turn 18, it is going to check that for any enrollment or service that starts after that date. So just keep an eye on that. You may have some clients that have aged into this question where that needs to be completed. And then again, I just have a reminder, any of the old responses, try to update it. If you're not sure what to do with it, just send us a help desk ticket. We're happy to assist on that. Moving on with the universal data elements. So we have the YN disab option. The column headers are all abbreviated, so I put the explanation of what these are for the ones that are not obvious. This one is, does the client have a disabling condition? It's a yes or no question. That's all it's looking for, is a response, again, that's not left blank or data not collected. Res prior and LOS prior are getting into the homeless history questions. It is prior living situation and length of stay in previous place. Destination is only going to show up for those clients that have been exited. But when they are exited again, it's just looking for anything but that. So client doesn't know, client refused, no exit interview completed. All of that is considered to be a complete response. If you look at some of the others, you will see null values for some of those responses. For completeness, those are acceptable for that. That should be good news for emergency shelters who have a lot of clients that disappear on them. They'll still count as long as you're not marking it as data not collected or leaving it blank. Head of household, this is looking at the relationship to head of household question. It also determines, if we go back to that one overview page, what data elements have to be collected for certain clients. So if someone is marked as self head of household, they have to have some of that information updated. If they're not a head of household, they don't have to. But I will also say that every household, whether it's an individual or a family, has to have one person marked as self-head of household and only one. So just keep in mind, if it's an individual, they are going to be self-head of household. And then LOC or LOC is looking at the client location question. The only exception to the response I have here is SSVF, who does have, outside of Pinellas, SSVF projects in HMIS because they are under St. Vincent de Paul and St. Pete. Otherwise, for basically everybody else, every client you serve should be marked as the following response for their client location is FL 502, St. Pete, Clearwater, Largo, Pinellas County, COC. That is our COC identifier from HUD, and this determines what clients show up in a lot of our federal reports. So this does need to be completed for every client and should always be marked as FL 502 unless you are SSVF or maybe a future project that serves clients, in Pasco, Pinellas, or Hillsborough, Pinellas. So everybody else, I think pretty much everyone on the call should just be selecting this as the FL 502 option. Moving on, we're going to go on to the additional data elements. DV, again, this is the question, domestic violence victim survivor. There are two other questions after that that are not included in completeness, so it's just looking at that first one. And again, anything but data not collected or left blank. I think if I repeat that enough, everyone will get the idea. For services, this one's a little different. Again, this is looking at, this is the SVS column. It's looking at, is there a service by the same provider as the enrollment during that enrollment? So if you have a client that's enrolled from October 1st through October 5th at a service on October 3rd from the same provider, that will count. If you have the same client from October 1st to October 5th, but their service was entered on October 6th, it's not going to count because it falls outside of that client's enrollment window. So is there a service provided by the same project? And does it fall within the client's dates of enrollment? So that's what it's going to look at in this case. So just keep that in mind that the date does matter. Unfortunately, the timestamp also matters. So if you do a very quick enrollment, same day, open and close, just make sure when you add in the service that the service time also falls between the entry and exit date and time, if that's something that you need to be reporting on to your providers or your funders and your supervisors and bosses. With shelter providers, again, with Shelter Point, it will automatically record. If you're doing an enrollment for 6 months, it shouldn't be very difficult to add the service within that date range. But if you're doing very quick open and closed enrollments, you may run into some issues with this data element. For the next three, these are the yes, no's. Yes, no, Inc. is income from any source, yes or no. Yes, no, and C is the non-cash benefit question, non-cash benefit from any source. And then the last one is covered by health insurance, yes or no. Again, looking for a response that's not data not collected or leaving it blank. These are left blank some because they don't necessarily show up. They're sometimes stuck between the sub-assessments where the HUD verifications are, so they can be missed. So just be careful, kind of go slow with the data entry, make sure you're not skipping over them. HUD verifications are the first time we see something that's actually different from making sure it's not data not collected or left blank, and where it's not just okay or null in the report. With this one, you're going to generally see numbers, and what that means is the number is how many of those responses that are expected are actually complete. So with these, there are a number of responses that the report is looking for. So the OK equals is telling you how many responses there should be, how many of those responses from the HUD verification window you should be seeing. Disabilities is 8, income 15, non-cash benefits is 6, and health insurance is 10. So in this first line, you see disability 7. If you go into the entry, you won't see that green check for the HUD verification. You'll see the red triangle. If you click on that, either there's one that was marked as data not collected or left blank. That's going to be the most likely response for that. And so all you have to do is just make sure you update that last one. With income, it's the same way. There are 14 out of 15, so there's just one missing. Sometimes it means you're updating that information and maybe you closed out the old one and added the new one for the wrong date. And so it didn't line up with the entry, or you forgot to add the new one after you closed out the old one. It just means there's a couple missing. If you see a null, a red null, it means that the entire HUD verification section was left blank. But what this is looking for is there a valid, complete response for all of the different options in the HUD verifications? The only one that's different is income amount. And again, this is looking at those specific income sources. So from the 15 sources here, it's checking if you marked yes, they're receiving employment income, or yes to SSI, SSDI, one of the other options. Is there an amount, the monthly income, the monthly amount recorded for each income source that's greater than 0? You said they're receiving that income. It just wants to make sure it's in there because, again, we do measure income, we report on it. It factors into eligibility. So if you mark them as receiving that income, just make sure an amount is recorded. Moving right along to services. This part's gonna be really quick because we've already talked about basically everything here. Again, for that overall, check for required for, make sure you're collecting that information for those required household members, whether it's for everybody, just the adults and head of household, or just the head of household only. And again, the service is a lot easier because services are generally offered as a one-day service. Occasionally they do last for longer. All this looks at are the services that fall with that start date between the report start and end date. So we're not looking at services that overlap because they're being done for a month. It's only looking at start date. So if you're running it for the month of October, only those services that were started in October will count. If the service overlaps into November, it's still not going to show up. So again, with this one, the same example, starting from day 2 to day 7 of week 1, this service, week 1, day 1 is not included. Any service added for start date of 8 or later is not going to be included. It's just this 6-day window in the middle where those services count. And again, for every single one of those services, you will be, the report is going to expect that the information is checked, complete and verified. Service detail for the client detail for the services report, very short. Just like the overall was very short, this one is very short. Same basic thing, try to fix any red values if possible, anything that's null. And this is also a place, it's a little more difficult with services because someone could receive a service a day, 2 services a day, but you can still check to see, what was the start date, what was the end date on those services, make sure that you're seeing as many people or as many services as you expect to see in that date range. If the number is off, it probably means there maybe some duplicated services or services under the wrong client or provider. So just kind of keep an eye on that one. Again, it's more difficult with services because of the volume, but you can still do some basic checks on that. All right, so completeness, slight differences between the 2 reports. Overall, the same basic principle is there, the same process. Check for data not collected, check for blank responses, make sure things are filled out. That's really what they're getting at. It's a relatively simple concept, but obviously with the amount of clients that a lot of you serve, it can be very easy to skip over a few things. You probably have the information on some of the intake packets, just maybe a case manager forgot to get that data into HMIS. So try to update it where you can. If you don't have that information, obviously you won't be able to update it. And we want to make sure we're collecting as much as possible, but if you're not able to update it, it's also fine to some extent because we want to make sure the information that's getting in there is also accurate, correct information. So timeliness reports are also relatively straightforward because the one big thing about timeliness is you cannot fix it. So this is going to be an understanding of what the reports do and how to run them and what they show you, but you cannot fix timeliness. So timeliness is measuring from the entry date or the service start date to the internal clock in HMIS. So HMIS runs off an internal clock set based on the time zone that we're in, and it doesn't stop, it doesn't change. I can't even change it. So, it's something that is constant. So basically, if you add a service for yesterday today, it's going to measure, 24 hours, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, depending on the actual time that the service was added and the internal clock. But it's that difference. And the reason I want to stress this internal clock is that backdate mode or anything like that does not have an impact on timeliness. There's no way to reverse timeliness once it has been established. The primary goal for timeliness is just real-time data. We want to get as close to real time as possible, just because if you have a 7-day delay in getting that data in, and your agency admin or you are the agency admin and staff have a delay in getting data in, you're trying to run your reports and submit data to your funders. If there's a delay, it can impact how much data you're able to actually get from HMIS. So as close to real time as possible. The other thing is that real-time data helps with outcomes, planning, decision making, collaborating with other agencies. If you get your data in real time, or at least within the same day, other people can see that information. If there's a long delay, they can't see that information in the record. So that's the goal, is as close to real time as possible. Depending on your agency, your workflow, there may be barriers to that, which could be something to look at. Maybe there are things you can change internally, making sure the right staff have access, making sure, the workflow from getting that intake packet to getting into HMIS changes. But the closer to real time we get, the better the system functions, the better our data is, the more we can use it for. Like with completeness, timeliness, there are two different types of reports, one for entries, one for services. They follow the same basic reporting logic as each other, measuring from that entry date to the system clock, or that service start to the system clock. What they do is they pull the data for any entry or service where the start date falls within the reporting window. This is the one place where completeness does differ from, or timeliness does differ from entry or from the completeness reports. So for timeliness for entry exits, it's not about overlapping enrollments, it's about when that enrollment starts. So if the client was checked into the project before your reporting window, even if they're still active, it's not going to show up. So client A's first enrollment here, checked in on week 1, day 1. You're running your report starting on week 1, day 2. Because they were enrolled in the project before, it's not going to show up in the report. But anything else where the enrollment date starts in that reporting window will show up. The big reason we do that for local reports is if you think about a project that keeps someone in for 12 months or 6 months, if you have an issue with a record, that timeliness stays with you until they leave. So you never really know if you've made changes or if you've gotten better with timeliness until they're done. By doing it where it's only those that are being added during that window, it lets you see those changes month to month. So like, let's say you have 1 month that started where you were down staff, you had some issues with timeliness, you were at a 15-day average. We don't want that to sit there forever because we want to be able to see progress over time. And so next month, you're fully staffed, you're working really hard to get the data in, your timeliness is down to 2 days. So now we can show, October was 15 days, November is 2 days. Maybe in December, you fix some processes, you fix it, to where you're getting it in really quickly, and now you're down to, a half-day average. And so then it lets us at HMIS internally with HLA in our data review, and then also your own agency see that change. So it doesn't hold you accountable to those older changes. You see it then, but then you can move on. So you can see kind of in that process of reporting, is that an ongoing issue, or was it just like 1 month where you were down staff or people were on vacation or something happened that impacted it? So only the entries or the services added in that month will show up in the report. So again, service report looks very similar. Anything on week 1, day 1 is not included. Anything on week 8 or week 2, day 8 or later is also not included. You may see clients more than once if they have multiple enrollments or multiple services, but otherwise it's only those that have that start date that falls in the reporting window. Report location is the same in the shared folder. These are local reports that were developed, I think back in 2012 or even before. We have made some updates and tweaks to it, especially after the transition from TBIN to HLA with HMIS, but otherwise these are local reports, so you won't find them in the other folders. This is where the copies sit for people to use. So just like the completeness reports, you can find these in that shared folder. The way you run them, again, virtually the same. You click in the magnifying glass, you'll see the view report option. That's what you want to use. The prompts, also the same. The best part about ART, which is the reporting tool we use, is that once you get used to running some of the reports, you can essentially open up any of the reports in the public folder and run it without any issue. The big thing I want to point out with this one that is different from the others is effective date. Effective date should match your end date, which is this end date plus 1 day. Again, that is, if I want to run it through the end of October, my end date would be November 1st. My effective date would also be November 1st. I won't get into too much detail on the effective date because I want to make sure we have time for questions, but it is just this, it's just telling the software to pull the data in the system as of that date. So it impacts some of the data elements and the way they show up in the report. For timeliness, it doesn't have any real impact. It's a function of the reporting software itself. So just make sure effective date matches that the report end date plus 1 day, and you will be good to go. Service timeliness report, again, basically the same prompts. Leave EDA provider as the default provider unless we've figured out some reason why you need to change that. End date plus 1 day, pick your start date, and pick as many providers as you want. The one thing I will say with timeliness, we talked about which completeness report to use. Timeliness is just showing how quickly you get those services in. So if you want to run timeliness for services you provide, like financial assistance or rapid rehousing or something like that, you can show, like, we get people enrolled really quickly, we get our services in really quickly. You can show that because this is about the work that you're actually doing. With completeness, you're not collecting that information at different points in time. So using that report, you might hold yourself accountable to stuff you're not doing. This is stuff you are doing. So definitely feel free to run timeliness for those services as well as the entry exits. The two reports otherwise look the same. The color is different. So the entry exit report is green, the service report is blue. The one pulls off of entry exits, the other pulls off of services. Otherwise, they are formatted the same and show the information in the same fashion. There are 3 tabs to it. There's an introductory tab, which includes the grading scale and a basic overview of the reports. Then tab A, B, and C. Tab A is the summary tab. It will give you the overall timeliness, the letter grade, and the average in days for your entire agency for all of the projects selected. And then you will also see a project by project breakdown of timeliness. So it'll give you how many entries happened in that reporting window. It will give you your average timeliness per project, the grade per project, and then the overall average and grade again down here. So this helps to show, like, if you have a lower than expected timeliness score, is there a single project that maybe was understaffed that is having an impact, but everyone else is doing a really good job because they were fully staffed. So this is a way to see and show some of that nuance that may be occurring. Tab C, I'm jumping over B for a second, that's on the next slide. This is just by project type. So it's going to show you basically the same as what's above, except by the project type for your agency for the project selected. So this might be emergency shelter, safe haven, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, street outreach, permanent supportive housing, whatever it might be. It's going to group all of those projects together. It's going to sum up all of their entries, give you your average and your overall score. This is also nice because maybe, your timeliness is caused, not by your shelter staff who are doing, live intakes, but it's coming from rapid rehousing providers where they're getting the documentation, getting the verification, going through all of that before they actually put the data into HMIS, and maybe there's some holdup there. So this will show you if certain projects, project types are doing really well. Maybe some others have some things that you can do to improve that timeliness. So again, it's a different way of measuring and looking at your timeliness score. And then the last one, the one that really shows you what's going on at a very detailed level, is tab B, which is going to give you your timeliness score for every entry or service, depending on the report, for every entry and service in the report. So it will give you the project name at the top. So again, you'll still see, let's say you have a small rapid rehousing provider that has a timeliness score of 50 and you're not sure why. If you come here, maybe you'll see that we had a dozen entries that were all within a day, but there were a couple things that changed. With one, we had to enter some data that was skipped, so that's 150 days or something. Let's say you forgot to add a couple household members and you had to add them retroactively. Your score may be higher, and this will help show you, is it one record? Is it a few records that are really skewing the data, or is it, a trend overall? So it'll give you the client ID, it'll give you their entry date or the service date if it's the services report, and then it will give you date added, and this is the system date. This is, if I put data in right now, it's going to say something like 137, and it'll be November 30th at 1:37 and 15 seconds PM. And then it's going to measure from that point back to whatever my start date was, or my entry date. So the date added is going to be your system date, so you can actually see what that measurement is coming from. So again, this is great because you can look for any trends, any issues that might be causing your timeliness to increase. The one thing I want to say about timeliness too, before we move on to see if there are any other questions, is when I stress that timeliness can't be fixed, it's because we can't change the date added. The other thing this means is that if you find an error in a record that was, a year old and you have to add something, it's probably going to show up as an error. It's only going to show up as an error if you change the entry, if you have to recreate the entry or the service. If you're just updating client information in the entry assessment or the client profile, it'll have no impact whatsoever. So if you come across a record where there's something wrong in the entry that you need to correct, it's been 6 months, again, because the entry date was from 6 months ago, it's not going to show up in your report right now, but if you run the report for that month, once you recreate it, it will show up. I always recommend reaching out to HMIS first to see if there's any way we can help you, rebuild or fix that entry prior to recreating it, just so it doesn't have that impact on timeliness. At the end of the day, we want the data to be in there, to show that that person is enrolled or served through that project, but we also want it to be correct. So we don't want people to not make corrections because it will have impacts on timeliness. Completeness and data quality are far more important than timeliness is. But before you make that change, that might have that impact, we definitely recommend reaching out to us to see if we can figure out a way that you're not aware of that might help fix it without having to go through that recreation process. So we have about 20 minutes left. I will move on to see if there are any questions. I know there's a fair amount to cover. Again, because we don't have like a demo site for the reports, it's hard to do a large scale training like this. So if anyone is interested in sitting down one-on-one to cover some of this material, we can definitely set something up. Just send us a help desk ticket. But I wanted to see if anyone had any questions about completeness, timeliness, if there's anything related to this that they wanted to ask. I'm going to pause for a minute and see if anyone has anything they would like to ask. Yes, so yeah, Tony, there is a needs report that I developed with Ruth when she was with 2-on-1 to basically address the same thing. It is, build off the same basic format. Because there needs to be some data point to collect that information. And so that's where the needs came in for that. Okay, so we have a question about the data quality framework report. This is also the 640 report. It can be found in that shared folder. That is a very complicated report. There is a webinar series on that. I am planning on trying to rework that, but there are some reporting changes coming to HMIS in the next couple months from our vendors. So things will likely be changing as far as what the reports look like and what's available. The data quality framework is one that I think is probably going to get redone by WellSky. The webinar is still accurate. That is on our help desk. The report is very lengthy, and it takes about 90 minutes just to go through the report without any questions. The major difference between that one is that whereas this one looks at, is the answer complete? The 640 takes it a step farther and starts to look at, do these questions make sense? So it starts to look, or are they usable too? So it breaks out if someone has a response but doesn't know or refused, the 640 will acknowledge that as an error, whereas completeness views it as complete. So it's just, that one's taking it a step farther. It's not just looking at, is it complete? It's looking at, is it usable? That's the primary difference between the two. And like I said, we will be doing some more of these in the future. So depending on what those changes look like for art after the new year, we will either be covering the 640 or whatever possibly replaces it from WellSky. And I should say too, so I think the next reports that will likely be covered for those interested will probably be the APR and the CAPER report. Those two reports use the same system logic, so they can be covered essentially at the same time. They just, the APR is a lot longer than the CAPER. Those are also lengthy sessions, but we will be looking at putting something like that together, because those are, if you get ESG funding or if you have COC funding, those are required reports. So they are definitely in demand. And those will probably start again sometime after the turn of the year, because we are almost to December. So maybe sometime in January or February, depending on scheduling. Okay, so not seeing any other questions coming in right now. That is basically all we have. If anyone has any questions, I'll stick around for a little bit just in case. Okay, so yes, so we do have one other question Tony just sent in. And it's if you can see completeness reports by each person that entered them. So with the entry exit report, we do have that is broken out by the user that created that entry. So that is in that report. For services, it's not. I know for Tony, for you, you're looking at that needs report. I can definitely make that change. For services, it's not as a general rule because we have a lot of agencies that do different things. And so someone is collecting that information and doing that initial data collection, but then other people are just putting in that service throughout. So that one functions a little differently, but for entries, we do have it by the user that created it. For services or for referrals or for the needs, if that's something that you want to see, we can definitely make that change. It's just depending on your agency's workflow. It may not line up with exactly what you're looking for. But yeah, if you are interested in that, definitely let me know and I can look at making those changes. I can go ahead and do it for the needs report, and then I can go ahead and actually do it for the services report too. For those that are interested, but just know that your agency workflow may not reflect how that data actually goes into the system. If you have someone that's doing all of your data entry and someone else that's collecting it. All right, so if anyone else has any questions, I will stick around for a little bit while people log off, so you can feel free to ask. Otherwise, once the recording is finished processing by Zoom, we will get it posted along with these slides and get the copy of everything sent out to everyone. I hope everyone has a great day. If we don't have any conversations between now and the end of the month or next month, I hope everyone has a wonderful holiday season. Happy New Year. Hope everything's going really well for you. Feel free to reach out to us. I have the help desk information up here. We'd be happy to respond to any questions that you may have. So thanks, everybody.